Welcome everyone, this is Honest Restart. So, I find myself incredibly excited and hyped for Xenoblade Chronicles Definitive Edition. I think this game is going to be great. I think it might just be the most ambitious remake Nintendo has ever done. But I'm sure some of you are saying, wait, hold on a second, Xenoblade Chronicles Definitive Edition is not a remake, it's a remaster. And I'm not so sure that's the case, but that's the point. There's been a debate about this. This last week, there's been a whole bunch of talk about whether it's a remake or a remaster, or what even is a remake or a remaster. It's been all the talk amongst the different Nintendo YouTubers on Twitter. So then, what is it? How should we define Xenoblade Chronicles Definitive Edition? Is it a remake, or is it a remaster? Now before we dive even deeper into this topic, I'm going to quickly talk about our social media. I have a Twitter page, check it out if you want to see what I'm talking about throughout the week. It's linked in the description below, as well as our Discord community if you want to talk with other people who watch the channel. That's also in the description below. And then of course there's our Patreon page, and there you can get some different perks and benefits if you decide to help support the channel a little bit more. Some of those benefits include being credited at the end of our videos or having your own dedicated topics during the podcast. If any of that interests you, it's all in the description below. Moving on though, how should we define this game? I think before we try and classify what Xenoblade Chronicles is, I think we should first sort of talk about how we should define what a remake or a remaster is. Except that's where things get a little tricky, because the definitions are not clear-cut. There is no Oxford Dictionary definition for what a remake is when it pertains to gaming, nor is there one for remastering. Sure, when we talk about remastering, typically that means taking some sort of movie or song and remastering it onto a better form of media, and it usually looks or performs a little bit better. One example would be the Lord of the Rings series on DVD. When they put it on Blu-ray, the movies are being represented in HD as opposed to standard definition like on DVD, and they do look better. They have improved the quality of these movies visually. And we see this for games all the time. All sorts of games are brought over from one older system to another, and they are, by that definition, remastered. They improve upon the digital or visual quality of this game. But it isn't necessarily clear-cut, because on some occasions, they do a little bit more than just upscaling the game into HD and improving the audio. Sometimes they change around the controls, sometimes they introduce additional content. One example would be The Legend of Zelda The Wind Waker HD, and there's even been some debate about that even being considered a remake because they redid a lot of art assets and things of that nature, but ultimately they made the game in widescreen 1080p, but they also included better textures and a new lighting engine, and they even include some additional content with the tingle bottles, while also changing around the structure of the game a little bit in terms of being able to sail faster, or the whole Triforce quest towards the latter half of the game. All of this was meant to modernize the game and improve the quality of it, but in terms of what it should be called, I feel like that it's definitely debatable. When I look at Wind Waker HD, I would define that as a remaster simply based off how I see it visually. But others would define it as a remake because they changed around assets and created new art and things of that nature. But at the very least, I feel like people could agree it's more of an ambitious remaster than other remasters where they just take the base game and just spruce up the visuals a little bit by upscaling it to HD, and everything else about the game is fundamentally unchanged. I feel like the takeaway from here is that it's not really clear-cut. There's a bit of a spectrum here. There is the bare-bones minimum sort of remaster where they just take a game and upscale it a little bit for a newer system. And then there are remasters where they actually go into the game and they change actual mechanics of the game somewhat when it comes to quality of life changes so the game flows and plays a little better for the modern era, but they also change around the art a little bit or the actual textures or lighting so the game looks a little bit better. But those remasters still are basically the same game. They're not recreating everything from the ground up or most of everything from the ground up. But that also brings me to another interesting point. Some people would argue that a remake has to be fully from the ground up. There cannot be any sort of recycled code whatsoever. But I have a problem with that definition, because if that were the case, that would mean that very few things would really be from the ground up, because almost every type of game that is developed on now has some sort of reused asset from some sort of other previous development cycle, maybe not even necessarily the same game. On multiple occasions, it's been said that Super Smash Bros. Ultimate has been developed from the ground up. Not many people really argue that this game is not a sequel. It is for sure a sequel to the previous Smash Bros. Entries, on Wii U and 3DS. Smash Ultimate had a fairly long development cycle. It was more than a year, it was like about 3 years last I checked, and they've been continually working on the game with DLC and patches. But the reality is, while this game has had a long development time and has had a whole bunch of improvements and changes and new content, it still has some reused assets from previous Smash Bros. Games. So does that make Smash Ultimate more of a port rather than a brand new game? In my opinion, Super Smash Bros. Ultimate is 100% the next entry in the series. It is not a port, and there really shouldn't be any debate about it. If I take a few pieces of wood from a treehouse and I use those pieces of wood to build a whole new treehouse, is that new treehouse not really a whole new treehouse? I'm sure somewhere someone will disagree with that analogy, but my point is that you can repurpose content and it can still be a full whole new project. The main point I'm trying to make here is that I don't think a remake should be defined as entirely new code with nothing whatsoever brought over from a previous development cycle. The way I would define a remake is when you take a game, an old game, and you recreate it with new technology. A couple examples that come to mind are the Resident Evil Remake, or Metal Gear Solid Twin Snakes, or the Spyro Trilogy, or the Crash Trilogy. Those remakes took the base game and recreated those games with new technology. In terms of gameplay, there were very minor changes. They were simply quality of life changes to improve the experience of the game. They modernized the experience. But, as I'm sure some of you may already bring up in the comments, Crash Bandicoot by the developers isn't called a remake, it's called a remaster plus or something above your typical remaster, but not quite a remake. And there lies the source of the debate. What developers call their games. Sometimes developers call their games remakes, sometimes they call them remasters, sometimes they just ignore that terminology altogether, like Xenoblade Chronicles Definitve Edition. Throughout most of the history of the industry though, I felt like it was, for the most part, understood what a remake was. But what we used to define as a remake, something like the Crash Bandicoot trilogy, is now being called a remaster by some different people. And then take, for example, something like the new Resident Evil remakes, like Resident Evil 2 Remake, Resident Evil 3 Remake, or even Final Fantasy VII Remake. These games aren't really even the same game anymore. These are remakes that are doing something different with that initial story and world for that game. I would actually classify them as reimaginings. But who am I to say that developers and publishers are wrong? If that's what they want to call them, then that's what they are. But I think the point I'm really trying to get at here is that a reimagining like Final Fantasy VII Remake or Resident Evil 2 Remake, they're also remakes. But a reimagining is a more ambitious remake. In other words, this is another side to the spectrum, how you have your basic HD ports, which I would still call a remaster, but then you have ports like Wind Waker HD, where they are greatly remastered, where they have new content and new assets, new lighting, things of that nature. But then you have remakes where they build the game effectively from the ground up with new technology, but it's still basically the core game just with some quality of life changes, and it looks a lot better with a new graphical engine, but it still plays the same. And then you have something like Resident Evil 2 Remake or Final Fantasy VII Remake, where they take that story and world and they sort of expand upon it, and they have an entirely new gameplay style where you explore and interact with the game in an entirely different way with a whole new graphical engine. There is a spectrum. And I think it's also important to note that definitions are kind of fluid. They change over time. I personally would prefer that their things would stay a little bit more constant, but I also would be lying if I didn't admit that there have been times where I've used the term remaster or remake interchangeably. It is a bit of a blurred line situation. I don't think it's always clear cut. Sometimes I do think it's fairly obvious, but other times not so much. And perhaps with Xenoblade Chronicles Definitve Edition, that's kind of the case. There are elements of Xenoblade Chronicles Definitve Edition that Nintendo themselves have said that are actually remastered, like the soundtrack. And for what we've seen of the trailers, it does look like some of the animations have been reused. So then, does that mean Xenoblade Chronicles Definitve Edition is more of a remaster? Well, in my opinion, still no. Let me explain. Yes, Xenoblade Chronicles Definitve Edition does reuse some assets and components from previous Xenoblade games, including the original Xenoblade. But as I discussed earlier, that's very commonplace throughout pretty much every single development cycle. Rarely is a game developed entirely from the ground up without a single reused asset anywhere. But I don't think that means not from the ground up. You can reuse assets or components to build something entirely new. And I think that's what they've sort of done with Xenoblade Chronicles Definitve Edition. The environments and textures and character models seem to be entirely new, there's new geometry here, there's a new art style when it comes to the actual character designs, actually different designs here. And for when it comes to the gameplay, we've been told there have been quality of life changes, things have been smoothed out and made easier, meaning they've actually improved the mechanics a little bit. And when it comes to the menus and the UI, that's been dramatically overhauled. And on top of that, there is entirely remastered music. But even more recently, we've learned that there is also the epilogue story, which to me seemed a lot like Torn of the Golden Country, basically a whole new little adventure. And even more recently, we've gotten some information that suggests that. We know this is going to take place in an entirely new map a year later after the events of Xenoblade Chronicles, and they are going to be using a new battle engine. So this game has remastered music, new songs for the new areas, with a whole new map, a new battle engine, quality of life changes to improve the initial gameplay and combat, and new menus, and an entirely different design for the characters and art style, and new geometry for the entire world, along with new textures and lighting. So much has been done here that, to me, I would classify this as a remake. This is going to be a new way to experience Xenoblade Chronicles Definitive Edition. They've taken the initial game and recreated it with new technology and enhancements and new content. From my perspective, this is far more ambitious than any other remake Nintendo has done, such as Ocarina of Time 3D or Super Mario 64 DS, and I would also say it's more ambitious than other games that have been defined as remakes by other companies, such as Resident Evil Remake or Metal Gear Solid Twin Snakes. Is it more ambitious than the Resident Evil 2 or 3 remakes or Final Fantasy 7 Remake? That's certainly up for debate. I'm sure a lot of people are going to say that no, Xenoblade Chronicles Definitive Edition is just not as ambitious, but how would you define that? Because these games are doing something different to the core gameplay? If doing something different is what you use to define these more ambitious remakes, then what say you to Future Connected, an actual epilogue story that has a whole new map and battle engine? That sounds pretty new to me. But at the same time, Xenoblade Chronicles is staying true to what the game was. They're not changing fundamentally what the initial experience of Xenoblade Chronicles was. They're simply creating a definitive edition for what that experience is. So when it comes to clearly defining where I think Xenoblade Chronicles Definitive Edition falls under this spectrum that I've talked about, I don't think it's a remaster. I do think it's a remake. I think it's on that side of the spectrum, but it's not all the way at the end where I would call it a reimagining or reboot for the series like Final Fantasy VII Remake or Resident Evil Remake 2. Not like that so much, but it is a new way to experience the game. It has entirely new visuals, quality of life changes, remastered music, a new story and area with a new battle system to actually try out within this game, and I think that's just an incredible amount, so I do think it should be called a remake. And when it comes to sort of why it really matters whether we call it a remake or a remaster, it doesn't really. At the end of the day, if you want to play it, you play it and you enjoy it. That's really all that matters. But when it comes to sort of classifying what this game is in terms of the amount of work and changes that went into the game, a remaster implies that it's not really that different compared to the original. A remake does, and there is a lot changed here, a lot added here with Xenoblade Chronicles Definitive Edition. And that's my opinion. Xenoblade Chronicles Definitive Edition is a remake, not a remaster. But what do you guys think? Do you guys think it should be called a remaster as opposed to a remake? Does it really matter? Let me know in the comments below. Anyways, everyone, thank you so much for listening and watching, and I'll see you all really soon. Take care. Bye.